Welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. We are thrilled to have a brand new guest, a fellow historian, Seth Hanson. Seth and I have a big topic to discuss today. It's one of my most intriguing generals of World War II. Who are we talking about today, Seth?
We're talking about Georgy Zhukov, who is the most famous and probably the most successful Soviet commander of World War II.
Yeah, I've always wanted to do an episode on him, so I really appreciate Seth coming on the show. And yeah, we're going to dive into this Zhukov fellow. He was born December 1, 1896, in pretty much poverty near Kaluga. He grew up in a peasant family and worked as a furrier's apprentice. What was his upbringing like?
So he was born in December 1896, and basically the family was pretty much poor the whole time. His father was in that area. It's right around western Moscow, and the father pretty much had been banned from working in all the factories that are in that area. So the family was pretty poor because of this. And so Zhukov grew up in relatively poor, and in some of the mythology that the Soviets would later do when Zhukov became famous is that he became a rag to riches person because of this. But to some extent, the family was poor, but because they were in the industrial part of the Russian Empire at the time, he wasn't as poor as maybe other parts of Russia would have been at that time.
Yeah, and he was educated a little bit, right?
Correct. His father and mother pushed him to go into school quite a bit. And so he got actually, for Russian standards at the time, he got to read and actually became a lifelong reader. Thousands of books later in his personal library. According to Jeffrey Roberts' book, he had 20,000 books.
Could you hold that book up for us one more time, Seth? I just want everyone to see it.
It's called Stalin's Generals, A Life of Georgy Zhukov by Jeffrey Roberts.
Okay, everyone check that out on Amazon. Looks like a great book. Okay. So he's drafted into the Imperial Russian Army during World War I, where he earns decorations for bravery. Where was he posted and how did he perform?
So he goes to Moscow in 1908 to work with his mother's brother in the fur business. And he initially, when World War I broke out in August 1914, he wanted to actually just join the Tsar's army. But his uncle's like, why are you crazy? Why would you want to do that? So he waits to get drafted. So he gets drafted around July, August 1915. And he immediately gets sent into the cavalry division. And so he actually gets sent down to the southwestern front eventually. And that was around August 1916, he gets sent down to the southwestern front, which is, if you don't know your World War I, the Russians in World War I had the northwestern front, which is basically from the Baltic to about the middle of Poland, eastern front, which is from basically that to right about modern day Hungary, and then the southwestern front from Hungary down into just bordering Romania. And he gets there right at the tail end of General Alexei Brusilov's offensive, which is probably the most famous Russian offensive of World War I, which by the point Zhukov got there, he's not, the offensive is petering out. They're losing thousands of lives. But he manages to get there and he leads a couple charges. Obviously, he gets shot and wounded, but gets rewarded for bravery out of this.
So some early indications that he was destined for leadership.
Before he gets sent down to the Southwestern Front, he actually got posted into the NCO school that the Russian army had, partially just because of his early education. I mean, most Russian peasants, literally up until Soviet times, were not educated at all. So he's above average just already. So they send him to the school. He had a harsh instructor, from what Jeffrey Roberts tells us, but Zhukov and the rest of his fellow soldiers get rid of this bad officer, and he gets good training there. And he later said that is probably some of the best, except for the bad instructor training he ever had.
Yeah, and if you're in any kind of command structure, even if it's an NCO, you have to be able to read and write.
Yes, for sure.
So he joins the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War after World War I, rising steadily through the Red Army ranks. Can you briefly take us through the Civil War in Russia at the end of World War I?
So Zhukov is an NCO in the Russian army when the February Revolution happens, which is the revolution that topples Tsar Nicholas. He gets elected as the leader of his regiment because of his NCO status, as well as because the Bolshevik and the Petrograd Soviets order number 1, which is the famous order where the Russian army could elect its leaders. But that only lasted for about 2 months when his regiment decides that, oh, we're going to go home. So everyone goes home, including Zhukov. He wanted to join the Bolsheviks right away, or at least that's what he said he did in his memoirs. But there's some evidence, along with other future Bolshevik leaders, they did not want to join the losing side for fear of getting shot. So he probably waited at home for a little bit of time to see which side was going to win. And but he gets sick with typhus first, and then he joins the Bolsheviks. Because they put him in the cavalry, because literally he's a perfect cavalry officer, but unlike, he isn't very high in the Russian army at this time, right? So he doesn't have to, so there's no worries by the Bolsheviks that he's going to cause trouble, so they don't need to shoot him. So he can rise through the ranks pretty much. So he gets sent to fight Admiral Kolchak's, which is probably the biggest white Russian army force way out in Siberia. He does that for a couple years, and then he fights around Tsaristan, which is what would become Stalingrad. And so he fights under Stalin a little bit, but there's no evidence to state that he met Stalin at this time, probably because he's a minor officer at this time. So he gets to fight in mainly those 2 theaters. And basically the Russian Civil War is that the whites are trying to overthrow the Reds and reestablish some kind of government. They say they want to bring in the Tsar, but Tsar Nicholas gets shot in July 1918 with his family. Some historians and other people would say that they were trying to make some kind of democracy. We don't really know what the whites would have done because they didn't win. The main reason why they didn't win is because the Reds, or the Bolsheviks, controlled the industrial area of Russia at the time, which is Moscow, Petrograd, which will eventually become Leningrad, Stalingrad, and a lot of the Ukraine areas. And the Russian Civil War goes from 1918 to 1921.
Yeah. And Lenin and the communists win, but Lenin dies not long after, so Stalin takes over.
Correct.
And one of the biggest things he does with the military, he has a great purge, which eliminates many senior officers, an event that opened up opportunities for capable commanders like Zhukov. What were these purges about? Were they loyalty or something else?
Well, it's not really to do with loyalty. It's to do with something else, because basically, if it was about loyalty, some of the military officers wouldn't have been killed, because some of them were pretty loyal and had no reason to do anything against Stalin. They were just shot. It was really to do with Stalin's paranoia. He believed that majority of the officers in the Red Army or Air Force or Navy, wherever they were, because all 3 were affected, was that he was afraid that they might have been tainted by the whites in the Russian Civil War, as well as the possibility that Nazi Germany, who's obviously rising at this time, and Japan is rising at this time, that the fear was that they were going to use these generals that might have been corrupt, and so they need to get rid of. And so that's the main reason why Zhukov rises to the ranks at this stage, because by the start of the purges in 1937, he has been slowly moving through the ranks to the 20s and 30s, but he's not Eisenhower or anyone else you might think in the West who's just been meteorically rising. He's not doing that. Zhukov has been slowly going. In 37, when everyone starts going left and right to the Gulag or get shot, Zhukov rises to the ranks quite rapidly. And Jeffrey Roberts gives the story of how Zhukov literally was so fearful that he had a suitcase full of clothes underneath his bed and a gun by his side, just in case he needed to shoot the NKVD coming. Obviously, he probably would have been shot and killed if they did come for him, but
he had a go bag ready and packed.
Yes, he did. Yeah. And which there's other stories of other Soviet generals that did this. And I mean, even some of his colleagues were not shot, but they would be sent to the Gulag, like Konstantin Rokossovsky, who was a Polish Soviet officer at the time. He will get sent to the Gulag and literally lose his teeth and will bear the scars of this the rest of his life, in a reminder of what Stalin did to him.
Yeah. It's interesting right now, Zhukov isn't well known, but he gains his first major recognition defeating Japanese forces at the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, showcasing his mastery of combined arms warfare. Why did he succeed here?
Well, it's partially because of his cavalry training, because basically so Jeffrey Roberts, as well as there's another book by Stuart D. Goldman called No Man Hand, 1939. It's about this. And basically, Stalin gets called to Moscow in May 1939 and says, there's a battle going on in Khalkhin-Gol. You need to go supervise or at least check to see what's going on. So that's what Zhukov initially goes to do there, just to see why is the fighting taking place? Why is the Soviets not doing as well as they should be doing, at least in terms of the general staff? And what can he do to fix that, right? So he goes there and he basically figures out that because of the purges, there's a lot of officers that are not qualified to be in positions. And this will affect the Soviets through the first couple of years of the war.
A great point to bring up. With these purges, a lot of people who were not qualified to be generals were elevated probably faster than they should have been.
Yes, there's a lot of that. In 41, 42, mainly 41, there is a lot of movement of moving people out where they shouldn't have been and putting them in where they are better qualified, or getting shot if they failed. And either way, but Zhukov goes there and figures out, one, the Japanese did this attack in early May, and so he gets there about June 5th, and he realizes that there's not good command. And so basically he sends back a telegram to Moscow and says they need to do a whole reorganizing, and it'd probably be better if I lead. And so he gets the command of what's at the time the 57th Corps. And so then he actually leads the defense in the second Japanese attack, which happens in the first few days of July. He barely actually contained that attack. I mean, the Japanese technically was literally that close to winning and then just failed at it because of tactics and mainly because of Soviet armor. And then he has a somewhat of, right after this, mid to late July, he actually technically is a major general in the Soviet army. And there's this marshal of the Soviet Union that's technically is superior to him. And Zhukov is preparing for this massive offensive that will encircle the Japanese army at Khalkhin-Gol. And the marshal's like, this is not the right plan, blah, blah, blah. And Zhukov goes and asks the general staff in Moscow, who's in charge? And they say, you're in charge. And so they create in July the first army group, which is Zhukov's totally in charge. No interference except for Moscow. No one else can tell him what to do. He launches this major attack on August 20th, 1939, which by September 1st, the Japanese 3rd Division and there's another division that gets encircled and absolutely destroyed. There's only a couple hundred people survive.
At a time when the Japanese weren't losing, like they were an unstoppable force.
Yes. I mean, Japan literally had conquered a lot of what China, they occupied the rest of the war. I mean, the Japanese hadn't really suffered a defeat at all until literally the Soviets did this. And this is part of the reason why the Japanese don't go to war with the Soviets later on and attack us, the United States and the British and the Dutch. And so Zhukov gets this major defeat, inflicts this major defeat on Japan. But as most people would know, on August 23rd, 1939, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact gets signed in Moscow. So it's a double blow for Japan. Militarily, they lost against the Soviets, but they also were deeply shocked that their supposed ally, Germany, has now signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, who are supposed to be the bitter enemy of both, right? So that's part of the reason why Stalin didn't per se know on August 20th he was going to get a non-aggression pact with Hitler, but it was already in the works by this point, so that's why he was allowed Zhukov to launch this major offensive and win this great victory.
Okay. Well, he must have done something right because he gets appointed chief of the general staff in 1941, just before Operation Barbarossa, where Nazi Germany attacks the Soviet Union. Why were Russian armies performing so poorly against Hitler's onslaught at the beginning?
Well, so first off, why was he appointed the chief of staff? Because he doesn't do anything with the Winter War. If most people would know the Winter War happens between November and March 1939, 1940. The Soviets should have easily beat and conquered Finland. That does not happen. They suffer huge losses. Well, Zhukov doesn't get any tarnish from this because he's still out in the Far East until May 1940. So then Zhukov gets a couple commands before the Chief of Staff, which mainly is actually probably the most prestigious besides the Chief of the General Staff, which is the Kiev Special Military District, which incorporates most of Ukraine. And he gets to take part in occupying Bessarabia and North Bukovina. Stalin decides he wants an aggressive general as his Chief of Staff. The problem is, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but basically Zhukov is a great tactician, as Gokhan Gal as well as future battles will show. He's terrible at staff work. Literally, throughout his rise to command, his superiors will say he's great field tactician, terrible at staff work. He could not be worse at it. And well, Chief of the General Staff is a lot of paperwork and a lot of staff work. He's not qualified for this, but Stalin believes that he needs an aggressive person in there, so he puts him in there. And so Zhukov really doesn't have a lot of time to reorganize the Red Army or do anything like that, because literally he gets command of it in January, but he actually doesn't get it in effect until like February 1st, 1941. And so he has 4 or 5 months in command before the Germans invade. And so he doesn't really get to do a whole lot. But the main reason why the Red Armies suffer defeats is a combination of two things. It's one, their commanders aren't really that good. Like we just talked about, a lot of people should not be where they are. The second reason why is because the Soviets are actually off put by the German attack. As most people know, there's 3 German army groups that are attacking towards Leningrad, Moscow, and the steppes of Ukraine, and eventually Stalingrad the next year. Well, the Soviets truly believe the Germans' main offensive will come south of the Pripyat marshes, there's a big marshland in modern-day Belarus in upper Ukraine. And throughout history, no one really goes into that area to fight offensives. So you either go north or south of it. Well, the Soviets thought the Germans would go south. And so they massed majority of their armies with tank forces, everything to stop the Germans there. Well, the Germans decided to go north because they want to take Leningrad and Moscow. That's their main objective initially, at least. So in the north, the Germans pretty much can get to Leningrad within about 30 or 35 days. They're to already Leningrad. They're well on their way to Moscow by this time. But in the south, the Germans actually, they're advancing, but it's a hard-fought battle. The Soviets are actually fighting up a pretty good fight for the most part of this time, until the Germans decide to turn south in the middle of August to encircle Kyiv. Zhukov doesn't have anything to do with this, because basically, within a month, Stalin realizes Zhukov isn't the best at coordinating all of these armies, at least in terms of the Chief of the General Staff. He gets placed in the Stavka, which is the supreme command of the Soviet armies, and him and a couple other people will be put in the Stavka, and he'll command that, be in that the rest of the war. But Chief of the General Staff, he gets removed, not because Stalin distrusts him or thinks that he's doing a terrible job, maybe a little bit, but he really gets command of the reserve front, which is basically the Soviets' idea of place the armies there to rebuild and organize to launch offensives. And so that's where he gets placed. And so he doesn't get blamed for the Soviet initial defeats or for the Kyiv disaster that will unfold in August.
Well, yeah, and you kind of have your prize racehorse stuck in the barn, your best tactician doing staff work. It makes sense to move him out of that role.
Yep.
He does play a crucial role in organizing the defense of Moscow, helping halt the German advance in the winter of 1941. How was his relationship with Stalin?
So he actually didn't meet Stalin until June 1940 for the first time. And Stalin basically loved him from the very first time he ever met him. Because of his aggression. Stalin loved aggression. And so he liked that about Zhukov. And so that's part of the reason why, like, he gets placed on the chief of general staff, right? Gets command of the reserve front. And then three things in 41 that he's most famous for. He launches an attack around Smolensk, which is obviously in Belarus, right? And the Soviets launch a major attack. They don't push the Germans out of there, but they stop them at least. The Soviets stop them. He does a great job in stopping at least the German advance on Moscow in September 1941. Then Stalin says, you're going to go to Leningrad. You're going to go save the city of Bolshevik founding, right? Because that's what Leningrad is to the communists. So he goes there, and he does play a pivotal role in stopping the German attack on Leningrad because he places the armies in the right spots and puts the right defenses up. But you could make the argument, because Hitler had already decided that we were just going to bombard it until it surrenders. Zhukov didn't really per se do anything, but hey, if propaganda-wise, Zhukov did it, right? Then he gets called to save Moscow, because after Kyiv and the 600,000 Soviet soldiers that surrendered to the Germans there, now it's the race to Moscow. And so throughout the fall, the Soviets, Roberts talks about this, as well as David M. Glantz, who's an excellent author on the Eastern Front, basically talks about the Soviets start pulling troops from Siberia, mainly because Japan isn't going to attack the Soviets. That was the biggest fear the Soviets had. Japan's going to go attack America. They had a bunch of spies. Famously, Richard Sorge, who's in Tokyo, is telling the Soviets all this. So Stalin starts sending men over. Zhukov, meanwhile, basically he puts up a tenacious fight to the Germans, to Moscow, but he never has enough men to really truly stop the Germans before Moscow until December 5th, 1941, when he's able to launch the Siberian divisions, because the Germans are so overstretched because of the winter, because of advancing this far. I mean, General von Paulus, who will become famous commander of the Sixth Army, did a war plan before the Germans ever attacked that the Germans could never have made Moscow, according to Paulus. So they were close. The story always goes the Germans could see the chrome of the Kremlin, in which they were that close. But they were just so tired from all the advance and taking all the prisoners and all the fighting, the Soviets were able to counterattack and at least save Moscow. The initial plan from December through the rest of the winter, early spring of 42, is the Soviets thought, now that the Germans are stopped, we're going to push them all the way back to the border. Yeah, that's a little over extreme. That the Soviets are not capable of that. The Red Army needed to be retrained, to be reorganized, and to learn how to fight. They were starting to get this by late 41, but they weren't ready. And so they save Moscow, but they're not capable of pushing the Germans back. And so it creates a bunch of pockets that'll come important later on.
Yeah, he's minimally involved in the great stopping at Stalingrad, where they basically grab victory from the jaws of defeat and beat the Germans there. But he's more involved in Operation Mars, isn't he?
Yes, that is correct. So I'm not going to get into really talking about the Battle of Stalingrad, but basically the Sixth Army advances, takes 90% of Stalingrad, and the Soviets in September 1942, Zhukov, Valesky, Stalin, and a couple other of the staff got meet, and basically Stalin asked them, how are we going to win in Stalingrad? And Zhukov and others say, well, we can encircle the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. So Zhukov does help set up that, but he doesn't have the critical role as Soviet historiography states. And that's just because, meanwhile, throughout the whole time of the Germans going to Stalingrad and going to the Caucasus to get the oil, there's what's called the Rizhev salient, which is right near Moscow. The Soviets, specifically Zhukov, are paranoid that the Germans are going to launch an attack from here to take Moscow, because it could, in theory, the Germans could do this. The Soviet soldiers would later say they called it the meat grinder, because they would just launch offensive after offensive after offensive, trying to break through what it was the German Ninth Army around Rizhev. Never, ever worked during the summer. So the Soviets stop. They stopped in early October. Meanwhile, they start prepping up for what will become Operation Uranus that will encircle the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Well, Zhukov and Stavka come up with the plan of Operation Mars, which is to eliminate the reserve salient. Zhukov helps coordinate both. David M. Glantz in his trilogy on Stalingrad, as well as his book on Operation Mars, points out Zhukov is flying constantly down to Stalingrad, up to the reserve salient. He's coordinating both. But he leaves the Stalingrad area around early November, or like November 5th-ish, somewhere right in there. He goes up, and on November 25th, so it was supposed to start days before Operation Uranus, but because of the weather and because of other issues, the Soviets had to push it back until after Operation Uranus starts and is successful. And so Operation Mars is the idea to get rid of the reserve salient, like I said. For an entire month, the Soviets launch attack after attack, again, with 4 armies in the Stalingrad and Western fronts. And they lose thousands of men, but they do not break through at all. The Germans not know that Operation Mars is coming, but by the time Mars is launched, Stalingrad is already in trouble. And even though the Germans do try to help save the Sixth Army in Stalingrad, the Germans also can move men up to help stop the Soviets doing the reserve salient. And so basically it becomes a kind of a pointless attack. But Zhukov is so determined to take it that he just keeps launching attack after attack. And it actually turns out to be pointless because in the early January, the Germans withdraw from the salient because they realize they've lost so many men and they can't hold on to it even more either. And so it was pointless for all these attacks. Throughout most of the post-war era, after Zhukov died and everything, they whitewashed that from Soviet history. They talk about his involvement in Stalingrad, nothing about Operation Mars.
Yeah, that's interesting. He gets promoted to Marshal around this time, correct?
Correct. He gets promoted as Marshal in January 1943.
Okay. He helps plan and execute the big victory at the Battle of Kursk, solidifying Soviet offensive momentum. And I want to ask you how he got along with other generals. There's a great quote from General Rokossovsky that I want to call to attention real quick. Quote, has a strong will, decisive and firm, often demonstrates initiative and skillfully applies it, disciplined, demanding and persistent in his demands, a somewhat ungracious and not sufficiently sympathetic person, rather stubborn, painfully proud, in professional terms, well-trained, broadly experienced as a military leader, absolutely cannot be used in staff or teaching jobs because he constitutionally hates them, end quote.
Yes. I mean, other superiors thought he could not handle staff jobs. Yeah. But his relations with other commanders are mixed. It depends on, and we'll talk about this in a little bit about his post-war, but certain generals actually worked well with him.
Stalin's kind of playing them off each other, right? It's almost like a competition with Zhukov and Zhukov. And
yes, that's a part of it, right? Because one, Stalin definitely plays them each other off, and that is prominent in the Berlin offensive, right? Ivan Kovanov, who's a fellow marshal by that point in 1945, Stalin says, whoever gets first can take Berlin, even though Zhukov is literally his front literally has Berlin right in front of it. There's no way Kovanov could have taken it anyways. But that's beside the point. Stalin plays them off with each other. And that's part of why some generals did not like how Zhukov was very brash and very hard to get along with, because Zhukov believed that everyone was supposed to perform at a high excellence, and not always did they do that, right? It's human nature. Not everyone's going to perform at a perfect way every time. But that's what Zhukov demanded pretty much. And some people got along with that well, others not so much. Mostly fellow marshals didn't really get along with him too well. And the part of the problem was too is that by this point in January 1943, as well as throughout the rest of the war, he's kind of, I like to call him a mixture of both Eisenhower and Patton in the Soviet version, because he's Eisenhower in the sense that with him being deputy supreme commander and marshal, he has literally the most power besides Stalin. And he coordinates multiple fronts. and he can tell which front to do what in any and you'll see that throughout most of the operations throughout the rest of the war. And that rubs people the wrong way in some cases. Some ways it treats them good, but he also can command a front, right? And that's where the patent part of him comes out, or at least I like to say, because he will command a front and usually does quite well, as he will do in later parts going to Berlin and such, because he knows how to do tacticianly. He's really great. Staff work, not so much. He had other people do that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about his personal life. Was he married or did he have any children?
So he had an illegitimate child in the Russian Civil War around 1920. He marries his first wife in 1920 as well, and he'll stay with her throughout the majority of his life. Actually, he'll divorce his first wife well after the war, and then he'll get married a second time, and he'll have a total of 4 daughters between the illegitimate and the 2 wives. The 2 daughters that are from the first marriage, the one specifically in his memoirs, as well as in her own writing, will say Zhukov was a great family man. Not so much during the war, right? He's too busy in the war to see anyone. But because he's a great family man is basically what the daughter says. But there is some evidence that he not only had the illegitimate daughter before he got married the first time, there is some evidence that he kept a personal secretary in the war and had relations with this other woman. At least that's what his driver throughout the war will say, but he denied it in his memoir. So who really knows? But he's definitely a family man throughout the whole time, and he cares about his wives, but he also is busy, especially this time during his life.
Sure. Yeah, he leads Soviet forces in the final push toward Berlin, culminating in victory in May 1945. Why was Zhukov chosen to personally accept the German surrender?
Well, it's a combination of he's deputy supreme commander, so he's literally the most powerful military as well as technically person in the Soviet Union besides Stalin. And Stalin wasn't going to go to Berlin at all, at least not yet. I mean, Stalin will in July 1945, but he's not going to accept the surrender. And 2, even at this point, the Soviet people think Zhukov is almost perfect, right? Greatest man except Stalin, because you can't go higher than Stalin. And so that's the main reason why he accepts the surrender of German forces on May 9th, 1945. Because of that reason, and because he conquered Berlin. He's the head. He commands the first Ukrainian front, and he drives it from right before Warsaw and takes Berlin. And so, because of all these reasons, that's the main reason why. And so, because of this, probably the highlight of his entire life would be the June 1945 victory parade in Moscow, because he literally got to ride a white horse down Red Square in front of Stalin and everybody. And I mean, this is high praise because Stalin is supposed to be the big guy, right? And he gets to ride the white horse. You'd think Stalin would have done this, but maybe Stalin didn't want to, who knows? But he gives Zhukov this honor, and Zhukov actually gets to stand by Stalin in the Lenin Mausoleum and actually gave the keynote speech of the whole day. Not Stalin, it was Zhukov. That's how high Zhukov was at this time.
Yeah, I was shocked that Stalin would share the limelight with anyone. But you're right. In May 1945, Berlin was a war zone, so I'm sure Stalin didn't want to go there.
Yeah, yep.
Well, after the war, Zhukov kind of falls out of favor politically and was reassigned to less prominent roles, reflecting the volatile nature of Soviet power politics. What were his later years like?
Okay, so like I said, June 1945 was the highlight, right? And so he does get command of Soviet occupied forces of Germany, because you remember Germany's divided into 4 after the war. Zhukov gets command briefly of these forces, and then he gets recalled to Moscow again in early 1946. Zhukov thought he was going to get more praise or get chief of the general staff again, but Stalin, in his paranoid belief, believes that Zhukov is getting too powerful. Maybe he even has plans to take over power, right? Who knows, right? At least that's in Stalin's mind. You don't really know what he's thinking. So first, He gets denounced and almost kicked out of the party within 2 years, and gets sent first to the Odessa military district, which is backwater in terms of Soviet military districts, mainly because of the fact that he's gotten too high on the horse. The official line is that he's claiming too much credit for the victory over Germany, which, rightly or wrongly, he does have some credit, but they blame him for that, as well as, and it'll come out more in 48, they blame him for taking too much stuff from Germany. Now, you got to remember, it doesn't matter if you're a marshal or if you're a regular a soldier in the Red Army. You took stuff from Germany.
Sure.
Germany destroyed the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union in the European part is absolutely destroyed. Thousands of people are killed from the partisans and the Holocaust and everything, right? So the soldiers punish Germany by taking anything that isn't bolted down. They take everything. Well, Zhukov is no different than this. He takes a bunch of stuff. And he tries to claim that some of it was gifted, some of it was bought, but it doesn't really work. It doesn't fly for Stalin. So he gets demoted. But what's interesting is that a fellow marshal dies in 1949. And actually, he gets to go to the funeral and actually is mentioned in Pravda again. So he starts to kind of get himself and actually joins back into not the party, but he's actually reelected to the Supreme Soviet in 1950. And then he gets into the Central Committee, which is even a step higher in the Soviet political government scheme. But even this is before Stalin's death. So even though Stalin decided to knock him down, he is starting to rise up. Well, Stalin dies March 5th, 1953. Khrushchev, Molotov, and Georgy Malenkov all decide that they're going to rule the Soviet Union. But they have one major problem, and that's Leonid Beria, who is the head of what will become the KGB. At the time, it's the NKVD. And they need to get rid of him because they're so afraid that, as Stalin jokingly told FDR at Yalta, he's our Himmler. That's literally what Stalin called him.
Well, everyone was afraid of the guy because he's the head of basically the KGB.
Yes, he's a terrible guy. I mean, there are terrible stories about him. Anyways, They need to get rid of him. And so mainly Khrushchev calls in Zhukov and says, will you help me do this? And Zhukov is like, yes, I will help you do this. And so basically, if anyone's ever seen the movie Death of Stalin,
there's that great scene where Jason Isaacs throws off his cape and he has like 800 medals, and it's just great.
It's funny. Yeah.
But maybe that speaks to his ego at the time. Like, look at me.
That would have been Zhukov's ego, though. And some of that is actually true, what Zhukov probably would have done in that situation. I mean, it's exaggerated, but, So, like, in the movie, there's the Malenkov pushes the button and Zhukov comes riding in with fellow soldiers and actually arrests Beria. They take him out. They actually do a trial. They do a show trial, but Beria is so bad, they don't even have to fake anything to have him executed. That's how bad Beria is. So then Khrushchev keeps him around. He actually commands in September 1954 the first ever Soviet nuclear test where they detonate the nuclear weapon and then they send soldiers in to see what would happen if they could fight in the battlefield, which is terrible to those soldiers, but that's what Zhukov commanded. And then in early 55, he gets appointed Minister of Defense, so the highest rank you can get in the Red Army. And he attends the Geneva Summit in July 1955, where he meets Eisenhower, because he met Eisenhower in occupied Germany right after the war. So this is the second time ever meeting Eisenhower. And the story goes is that he tells Eisenhower that we should be friends, both the United States and Soviet Union. And Eisenhower's like, well, the Soviets are doing terrible things in Eastern Europe, but he's like, that doesn't matter. We should still be friends. And it doesn't really work with Eisenhower, but they try to rekindle some kind of friendship.
I read something, and I don't know where I read it. Eisenhower learned that he was into fishing, and I guess he sent him like a box of fishing lures, and Zhukov loved them so much because I guess Soviet fishing lures are so poorly made that he thought it was like a really touching gift, and he used them for the rest of his life.
Yes, I've read the same stories, and Zhukov is not only interested in fishing. He does, from his youth, he always loved to go hunting too. So he is an outdoorsman, similar to what Eisenhower would be. So basically, Zhukov will keep in the Ministry of Defense through 1957. Khrushchev will use Zhukov one more time on his side to get rid of Malenkov and Molotov when they attempt a coup, as it's called, but it's not really a coup. They just try to use the political system, how this USSR works, to get rid of Khrushchev. Khrushchev actually outmaneuvers him mainly because of Zhukov's help. But then Zhukov gets told he's getting removed of his Minister of Defense because Khrushchev decides that Zhukov is too powerful. He's going to take over, right? Same fears as what Stalin does. And so he gets himself removed. And actually, he gets promised after he gets removed by Khrushchev that I'll find some position in the army. But that's not what happens. He actually gets removed from the army in early 1958.
Yeah, he dies of a stroke in 1974. And I want to talk to you about his legacy. I mean, I've seen some stories where he's the greatest Russian general of all time. You know, obviously there's a bunch like Suvorov during the Napoleonic era. But what do you think his legacy is?
Yeah, Zhukov has a very mixed legacy because, first off, like you said, in modern Russia, Suvorov, Kutuzov, and Zhukov are considered, in their minds at least, the greatest Russian/Soviet generals ever, right? And mainly because all three of them either won great victories or saved Russia, the Soviet Union, in times of desperate need, like Kutuzov at Borodino and the rest of the 1812 campaign. Well, Zhukov literally did that in the Great Patriotic War, as it's called in Russia today, of the Second World War, right? So Zhukov has that going for him. But one problem for his legacy that, at least in the West, has is that he's controversial in the fact that the Russian/Soviet winking of war is that you throw men into the battle. It doesn't matter if they're going to die or not. You're going to throw more men in there. Zhukov is criticized sometimes unfairly for that because at certain battles he gets like especially Mars. He shouldn't have continued on launching men into the battle when obviously it wasn't working to begin with. So why continue on? But at other times, like in the Operation Bagration or in the Vistula Oder offensive that drives him to almost to the gates of Berlin, there is some accusation of him sending men to death when they could have been used better elsewhere. But on the flip side, he is actually pretty good at saving men's life overall. And that is a remarkable thing, considering that from the Russian-Soviet point of view, you just throw men into the battle until the battle's won. That's just how they always fight. Because the two things you always hear about Russia and the Soviet Union is they have land to retreat and men to throw in the battle. And that's what they use to win their wars when they fight wars. That's how they do it.
Yeah, I mean, is he Alexander the Great or Napoleon or Caesar? Probably not, but the guy won a lot of battles.
Yes, he's not Napoleon. One thing that I didn't really talk a lot about is that another reason why some commanders didn't always work with him is that Zhukov had a short fuse. If you didn't do something right, or if the plan wasn't going like it was supposed to, he would just get so upset that he would just continue to throw men into the battle and try to win, and that didn't always work. Well, that's where he's not like Napoleon. He's not like Caesar, right? He can't always like, I need to send men this way to win the battle when I'm going to do it this way because that's what the plan said, and that's my plan, and that's how it works.
So adjusting on the fly wasn't his style. He would just throw more men into it. Yeah.
Not always the best. Sometimes when he was at his cool, he was good at it. But specifically, there's what's called the Battle of Seelow Heights, right before Berlin in 45. He launches an attack along his entire front, and there's these heights right in front of Berlin. And the plan was to shine lights on the Germans and break through. It fails almost immediately, but Zhukov gets so upset with it that he sends in the tanks and his armies too quick and all the men in too quickly, and it costs 3 days before they can get going. Meanwhile, his rival, Ivan Kovanov, to the south of him, is already on the march. He's actually, halfway to Berlin, and so this is where Stalin's playing off Zhukov and Kovanov because he's like telling Zhukov, "You better get going, or Kovanov's going to take Berlin." But Zhukov didn't have to really worry because once he broke through, he gets going. But again, Zhukov has a problem when he loses his cool. And sometimes that's not to his benefit. Sometimes it is in certain cases.
Well, yeah, and that's not going to endear you to your men or your junior officers if you're just hurling them at you can't win or tough win embedded positions. That'll just make everyone under you not like you very much.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, that was great. Yeah, I learned a lot about Zhukov. I really appreciate that, Seth. Just a quick call out. If you're not following our Facebook and Twitter pages for Generals of World War II, please do so. And yeah, Seth, this was fabulous. Thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, John. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, my pleasure.